Welcome to Op India. Today we have with us Professor M. Vidyasagar, who's the chair of India's Supermodel COVID Committee. So today, with Professor M. Vidyasagar, we are going to talk all about COVID, try and understand India's COVID story, especially the second wave of the coronavirus pandemic that has hit us hard. So welcome to the show, Professor M. Vidyasagar. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So getting on with the discussion, Professor, my first question to you is going to be about something that is affecting us the most, and that is the second wave of the pandemic. So we just would like to understand that how prepared were we for this second wave, and how much of it had we predicted, considering the fact that the first wave was not that harsh to us. So how prepared were we essentially for the second wave, and how much of it had we predicted already?
Well, if you judge by the events, it's obvious that we were not prepared at all. I think we were extremely complacent at all levels, from the government level to the ordinary people's level. I think that people just thought that, okay, the rest of the world may have had 2 or even 3 waves, but somehow we Indians were magically immune to all that stuff. So we can run around without masks, we don't have to take any precautions, and nothing will happen to us. That's primarily why we are seeing the second wave. There is another point also, which is that in the first wave, the central government took more or less a coordinated approach. I mean, they would have these weekly or so video conferences with people from various states, and then they would work out various strategies. That was the implementation was left to the individual states, but the overall strategy was worked out centrally. And I thought this worked really well. Whereas in the second wave, even when it wasn't yet a full-blown wave, the decision on how to tackle it was left to individual states.
True.
So this led to a great variety of responses, and some responses were very good and some responses were not so good.
Correct.
The other complicating factor was that when our first wave peaked in the middle of September, we saw about 10 to 11 million people who had contracted the disease, that is the positively tested people. And our Sutra model estimated that maybe around 50 times this many were asymptomatically infected and never detected. So that meant we had around 500 million people who were asymptomatically infected and therefore immune for a while.
Correct.
But as it happened, with the passage of time, the immunity of these people eroded, so that in some sense they were back to square one. They were susceptible again. And unlike in the first wave, where everybody was fairly scrupulous about following the COVID guidelines, March 1st, nobody was following any guidelines, as you know well. So they were basically like sitting ducks when the pandemic struck. So that's why the second wave is so much more fierce than the first one. The good news is that it has peaked, just as we had predicted it would. And whereas the first wave peaked with approximately 11 million people detected, in second wave, it's about 14 million people infected since March 1st. So from the standpoint of number of infections, it is not a whole lot higher. Why this particular wave feels more harsh is for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's very concentrated in time. The first wave was spread out over about 3.5 to 4 months, whereas the second wave is much shorter. The rise was very steep.
True.
The peak daily deaths in the first wave were about 1,200. The peak daily death this wave were over 4,000. The other point is that the first wave predominantly hit the less affluent segments of society, whereas the second wave hit much more the affluent members of society, the people who escaped the first wave, so to speak.
Correct.
So in some sense, people are noticing it more because the people who are hit by it are people that you and I would know far more likely than in the first wave.
Correct.
Couple of other noted changes are that this wave is affecting younger people, which the first wave barely touched. There are even a few reports of children catching it and passing away. Very, very sad. So there is some difference between the first and second wave. I suppose the only good news is that, as per our predictions, the wave has already peaked, and the statistics show that.
Correct.
So I think now we just have to ride out the rest of the second wave and take away whatever learnings we have and make sure that we don't have a third wave, or even if we do have a rise in cases, it will be just a small bump and not this kind of a catastrophic wave as we have seen now.
Correct. So, Professor, how closely had we predicted in terms of numbers, in terms of daily cases, daily new cases? How close were we to the predictions?
So about 2 months ago, we were not close at all. We made more like a month and a half ago, we made a prediction and made a presentation to the government on the 2nd of April. And at that point, we felt that the peak in the number of cases would come during the period of May 15th to 17th. And we thought that the peak cases would be between 1 lakh to 1.2 lakhs. So as it turns out, we were quite accurate in terms of the date of the peak, but quite badly off in terms of the number of cases. That's because the parameters of the pandemic were varying very rapidly. We kept recalibrating the model, the so-called Sutra model. And by the time, let's say, the last week of April came, it's about 3 weeks ago now, the parameters of the model had stabilized, and we haven't had to revise the predictions since. And they are following very closely. If I may, I can show you what our predictions are and how the actual numbers are tracking them. Can I do that?
Sure. Yes, most definitely.
Okay, let me do that then. So I guess I share my screen. Can you see this? The plot which says India?
Yes.
So this is the output of the Sutra model. The golden colored curve is what we are predicting, and the blue curve is the actual data. And as you can see, if you have really good eyes, we predicted that the peak would be at 3.78 lakhs, and it will be somewhere of the order of the middle of May. It's occurring actually about 3 days later, and it's about 3.88 lakhs. So whereas we had predicted a peak of 3.78 lakhs, the actual peak is 3.78 lakhs. We decided not to recalibrate the model for the time being because we don't yet know whether the small gap between the blue and the gold will disappear with time or will stay the same. If it doesn't disappear, we will recalibrate the model. And you can see that there's a drop-down menu here for a whole lot of states. And you can go to individual states and look up what they have. For example, it says Tamil Nadu. So if I hit Tamil Nadu, so you get this plot. You can barely tell the gold from the blue because it's following so closely. That's the good news. The bad news is we are here on 15th of May, and we are nowhere close to peaking. According to us, the peak will be somewhere like the 5th of June. And you can also go to individual districts within various states. I'm not sure if there are any in Tamil Nadu. No, there aren't any. But you can go to some other states, like Uttar Pradesh, for example. So according to us, the Uttar Pradesh has already peaked, you can see.
Correct.
The blue is definitely on the downward curve and so closely following the gold. And you can also choose various districts. For example, you can take Gorakhpur. And this is the data for Gorakhpur. Now, if you have good eyes, you can see the blue is again moving away right there.
Correct. Correct.
So that is a sign for concern. And this is the kind of information that the state authorities want. They
Correct.
want us to highlight any deviation from the model so that they can go out and figure out what is happening and, if possible, to take some remedial action. So this is a portal. It is called as sutra-india.in. And anybody can go and look at it, publicly available. So this is how we are sharing our findings with the public at large.
That's interesting. That's interesting. If I could just ask you a little bit about the Sutra model itself, the parameters and how these predictions are being made. Again, if I ask as a layman, so for, the variants, we are getting to know of so many variants that are hitting us and hitting us hard. So considering these variants, we don't really know how it's going to mutate and the previous data. So how is this model exactly put into place? If you could just, very quickly sum it up for us.
Yeah, certainly. You see, the data that you get in any pandemic is very noisy.
Correct.
So if you follow on a day-to-day basis, it goes all over the place.
Yes.
So if you try to get overly fancy and try to fit a very, very detailed model, you won't get good models. And even we don't try to fit the daily data. We fit the weekly moving average because that is what gives a good fit and takes out all these bumps I was talking about.
Oh,
so ultimately, we have only a small number of parameters. The most important one is the parameter called beta. Beta is called the contact rate. And what the beta captures is if a susceptible person comes in touch with an infected person, how likely is it that the susceptible person catches the infection?
Correct.
And that's where all these things you are mentioning come into play. What is the variant of the virus that the infected person is carrying? But that actually seems to be less important than are the people wearing masks? Are they standing close or standing far apart? Those factors are far more important in determining whether the infected person infects the susceptible person. So the way in which people deal with variants, either do laboratory experiments.
Correct.
And try to infer whether one variant is more contagious or less than the other. But you see, in reality, what happens is that the variant's impact is overwhelmed by all these other factors that I mentioned. In other words, if a person is carrying a supposedly benign variant, but is standing right next to another person and neither of them is wearing a mask, the result is going to be much more likely to be an infection than if both people are wearing masks, keeping their social distance, and one of them is carrying the so-called infectious variant. You see, I think people get a little bit hung up on this variants because maybe it gives them an excuse for not following the social norms because they can blame it on the variants. Say, well, I didn't do anything. So that's my explanation of the situation. So then the second parameter is called gamma. It doesn't change much from country to country. It's called the recovery rate. In other words, once a person gets infected and tested positive, how long does the person have to be under observation? Now, both in the first wave and in the second wave, of the people who test positive, about 80% are asymptomatic. So they're actually found through contact tracing. So if some person tests positive, they go and test the family member, anybody with whom they have come in contact. So these people test positive, but they have very mild symptoms, or sometimes they have no symptoms at all. So the ICMR guideline has been that if you are asymptomatic, just isolate yourself for 10 days. And if you have no symptoms after those 10 days, then you're deemed to have been recovered. The small 20%, they require further care. They're the ones who go into hospitals. And that recovery time is a little bit more variable, obviously. But again, on average, about 10 days is what it takes for the people to come out of the hospital. And of course, the mortalities that we're seeing, the fatalities, are all from this 20% that go into the hospital. So if you look at the people who test positive, the fatality rate is around 1.2 or 1.3%.
Correct.
Then the third parameter we have is called epsilon. This is one of our most important parameters. What epsilon does is it estimates the ratio between the people who are testing positive and the people who are in society that you don't even know about, who are actually carrying the virus. Or if you take the reciprocal, 1 over epsilon tells you that for every one person that you catch, how many are out there that you haven't managed to diagnose. So when I told you that in the first wave, this figure was around 50, that's what I'm talking about. For every one patient you identify, there are 50 others out there you didn't identify. This time, this number has come down to around 35. Now, why is that important? In the first wave, about 10 million detected patients multiplied by 50 gives you 500 million or 50 crores undetected patients and all, which includes the 1 crore 10 million that were detected. So now you have 14 million multiplied by 35 is again the same number. So something magic about this 500 million figure, that's the herd immunity level at which the pandemic will begin to recede. Okay. And the fourth parameter we have in our model is a very interesting parameter. And this is a novel feature of our model. It is called reach.
Okay.
So reach tries to say how many people or what fraction of people in society potentially came in contact with the pandemic. So reach is like a geographical spread.
Okay.
So in the sense that initially we may have had the pandemic in one part of the country and it's spreading to other parts of the country. That's at a very gross level, but you can also have it at a very micro level. So if you take a city like Hyderabad, for example, there will be clusters which are highly protected, like the gated communities and so on. Correct. But over time, even those gated communities get protected because somebody goes in to sell vegetables, or somebody goes in to clean or get a haircut, whatever. Right. So the rate at which the pandemic penetrates the whole country, that is the fourth parameter called reach. So those are the four parameters. Beta for the contact rate, gamma for the recovery rate, epsilon for the undetected, and rho is for the reach. Now, there are some reasonably messy looking equations, but I don't think your audience would be very interested in that. But we do have a paper. If somebody is mathematical minded, they can read this paper and understand how we fit the model to the data.
That's interesting. We can also share it with the audience in the description of the stream. So anybody who would like to review this data, it'll be available in the description of the stream as well.
It's already available now. It's already available now. If you want, I can even show it to you.
Sure, please. I'm waiting. I'll share the screen.
You want me to show it? Okay. So you asked for it. So
we can spend like a minute or two on it, just to understand.
Okay. So let me just make this bigger. So this is a paper you can see published on 30th January 2021. It's an online paper. And it's called Sutra, an approach to modeling pandemics with asymptomatic patients and applications to COVID-19. It's by Professor Manindra Agarwal Lieutenant General Madhuri Kanitkar, and me. And the equation. Let me just find it up for you. Okay, there's the Sutra model. And where I'm drawing the cursor now, those are the basic equations of the Sutra model. So they're not very complicated as equations go. And if you can see here, the acronym Sutra stands for susceptible, undetected, tested positive, and removed approach. So I'll stop this thing.
So thank you so much for sharing this. I think while we are not eligible to understand this amount of data, however, it's important to at least be aware of it. So thank you so much for sharing it. With this, my next question is going to be that how today do we tackle the misinformation? The reason I actually wanted to dive a little bit into the model is because of this, because there are innumerable people who are coming up with their own models just to ascertain the fact that the situation in the country is much worse than it is being portrayed right now. So people are coming up with their own models. We don't really know on what basis have they come up with those models, if they are at all eligible, to come up with such scientific and detailed models. But that is the kind of it. So it's not just the pandemic that we are fighting right now, but it's also the misinformation that we are fighting in terms of the actual situation in the country and vaccine hesitancy. But before we get into the vaccine hesitancy, this is one thing that I really wanted to understand, that how do we tackle the misinformation floating around?
Well, I would challenge your comment that others are coming out with models. Nobody I have seen has come out with a model. Nobody has come out with
we've recently seen a couple of tweets. Well, we're not going to divulge into the names, etc. But yes, I mean, these are all just to ascertain the fact that they've been put into the garb of articles and some research studies or papers or something like that. Just to say that, the actual numbers are 5x times or, things like that.
Yeah, but that's not a model.
Correct.
What I mean is, if somebody wants to pull some numbers out and say, based on number of cremations, based on number of death certificates, based on this, based on that, we think that India is underestimating deaths by 2x, 5x, 10x, 20x.
Sure.
How does that help you? Can you tell what this number is going to be 2 weeks from now? That's what a model should give you.
Absolutely.
If you can't do that, it's not a model, it's a guess.
True.
So let me just make a very simple point for all your readers. In order to be a scientific statement, a statement should either be verifiable or refutable. So if when I showed you our predictions for the Sutra model, if you want, I can bring it up again. But anyway, we said that at the end of May, sorry, not at the end of May, let me just check on that so I don't say something silly. Yeah, so I said that at the end of May, the model says that we should have something around 1 lakh daily cases per day. Now that's a prediction. You can come and catch our neck on June 1st and say, wait a minute, you said it's 1 lakh and it is actually some other number. You won't complain if it is lower than that, but you will complain if it is higher than that. That's what I mean by a falsifiable statement. Now somebody says that the number of deaths is 2x. How do you prove that? Now somebody else comes along and says, no, it's not 2x, it is 5x. How do you resolve this inconsistency? When the so-called experts themselves can't agree, then it's not a prediction as far as I'm concerned. It's not a model. Now, if you want to ask the question, is there underreporting? Our reaction would be, perhaps. But you see, the true cases, if any, would be some multiple of what we are showing. And it really doesn't matter what that multiple is. So if our model is predicting that the reported cases have peaked, then the true number of cases has also peaked, and it doesn't really matter what the multiple is. I think that's the only way to look at it. Okay. So I guess I don't consider all those other statements that government is underestimating this thing, that thing. I don't consider them to be models, and I don't consider them to be scientific statements. That is somebody's guess. Anybody can guess. They have their right, but it's not science.
Correct. And I think as audience, as consumers of such content and such data, it is important for us to be able to differentiate between a scientific data and a guesswork, like you very correctly said, because again, like I mentioned, a lot of them have been put under the garb of some kind of research, a study, and then they are, packaged as an article and they are put it out in the social media. So it's very seldom that somebody is going to actually go into the depths to try and understand that, okay, what their assumption or their claim is actually based on. But then exactly like how you said, that it is important to understand that there is a difference between a scientific data and a claim. So thank you so much for answering that for us. With this, my next question is going to be, like how I mentioned, about the vaccine hesitancy, which is being created currently in the country since a couple of months. So there have been all sorts of conversations that are happening, but vaccine hesitancy continues to kind of, take the forefront at the moment. So if you could just try and help us understand the role of vaccine, the importance of vaccine, and whether or not it could have been managed any better.
So India has traditionally not been a vaccine hesitant country.
Correct.
Unlike, for example, in the US, where a lot of people don't believe in taking vaccines.
True.
They conflate it with individual rights and constitution and all kinds of things. By and large, whenever we have said that children should be vaccinated, people accept it. The hesitancy, I think, has been artificially manufactured. And I think a lot of people don't really understand the nature of this disease. Because the thing is that in absolute numbers, if you believe the official statistics of 4,000 deaths per day, that is not a very large number. Because the average number of deaths in India per day is around 28,000. In a normal year, I'm talking about. So I have seen a lot of people take the attitude that, okay, we'll take our chances with the corona. That's a very foolish attitude. Second thing is that, so I'm trying to make a distinction between nothing will happen to me if I don't take the vaccine. Those are the people who say, I'll take my chances with not taking the vaccine. Then the other side is something terrible will happen to me when I do take the vaccine. And that kind of thing is much more prevalent from what I can tell. There is some graph which is going around showing that whenever there is a vaccination drive, the number of cases increase. So people confuse this and say, okay, that means that the vaccines are causing the uptick in cases. But actually, if you think about it, it's very simple. The vaccination centers are so poorly organized that the people who are going to get vaccinated are catching the corona in the vaccination center itself. So that statement is quite correct, that vaccination drives are followed by an uptick in cases. But that's more a commentary on the rather haphazard manner in which the vaccination centers are organized. No social distancing, no masking, nothing, versus the vaccines causing the corona, which is completely ridiculous. So for example, when my wife and I went to get vaccinated, we went to a private hospital. First of all, they said no mask, no entry. And then they had seats for people to sit, 6 feet apart. And it was like a railway station queue. When somebody got vaccinated, we all moved up one step. So the whole process took about 15 minutes, but then it was completely COVID compliant. And then there was a hall where we could sit because you have to go through mandatory 30 minutes of observation post vaccination. But I suspect that a lot of vaccination centers are not organized like this. They are organized in a much more unsafe and much more haphazard manner, so that indeed it is actually possible to catch corona in the process of getting vaccinated. Because you see, if you get your first shot, you don't really have any protection for at least 2 or 3 weeks. It takes that long to see some reaction. On the other hand, if you catch it in the vaccination center, the incubation period can be very short. It can be 2 days, 3 days, a week. So somehow the process has not taken this kind of things into account, it seems to me. So vaccine hesitancy comes a lot from this also. So let me just repeat once again for your viewers. The more educated people are saying nothing will happen to me if I don't take the vaccine. And the less educated people supposedly are saying something terrible will happen to me if I do take the vaccine. So you have to counter them using very different strategies. And let me tell you very frankly that I don't believe the government has done enough. I mean, having those irritating dialer tones, that's not a campaign. Okay. You actually have to go out, address the issue squarely, maybe through TV ads with prominent personalities. When is the last time you have seen an advertisement from the government pushing vaccination?
True.
I have not seen it.
Right.
So I think you have to, if you are going to have a multi-tens of crores doses of vaccine being administered, you should spend a little extra money to counter these issues very, very squarely. You should probably have volunteers going around on the ground level, talking to people in small towns and villages, getting them to overcome the vaccine hesitancy. I don't think we're doing enough of that. That's my feeling. Now, possibly, I don't know what all effort the governments are making, and maybe that is an unfair judgment, but that's how it seems to me now.
Correct. So definitely the vaccination drive, as you say, can be the communication, especially the communication in terms of getting vaccinated, getting inoculated could be done better. There is a scope of improvement there for sure. That is something that we can sense. And if you just could just throw some light on the vaccination drive otherwise, which is taking place currently. I mean, are you okay with the process, or could it be any better? Any comments on that?
So the vaccination drive is not going to have any impact on the second wave, because the second wave is already here.
Correct.
It's already on its way down.
Correct.
The real role of the vaccination is going to be in preventing the potential third wave, or if it does not fully prevent the third wave, moderating it so that it becomes a third bump, as I call it, instead of a third wave. So that's the real role for it. So we have typically about 6 months to vaccinate a reasonable number of people. There was an interesting paper from Italy that came out just literally 3 days ago. And what the Italian doctors had done was something very interesting. They had taken 162 corona patients, but they were symptomatic, not asymptomatic, but symptomatic. They followed these 162 patients and tracked how long do the antibodies last. And they found that the antibodies could last as long as 8 months. Of course, not in every single person, but in a substantial number of them, they were still there. Now, there are still a few questions to which we don't know the answer. For example, if we had followed asymptomatic patients, that is, they tested positive, but they didn't have visible symptoms.
Correct.
How long would the antibodies have lasted in them? So the time to have started that study was 8 months ago. Of course, we didn't do that. At least we can start now. But you can assume it will be comparable. So that means that this 500 million people that I mentioned earlier, the 14 million
Correct.
people who tested positive, multiplied by our estimate as a 35 times multiplier, these people can be expected to have some form of immunity for about 6 to 8 months, something like that. So that is the window we have to get a whole lot of people vaccinated.
Correct.
And if we vaccinate everybody, well and good. But even if we vaccinate only 60, 70, 80%, anything like that will help to moderate the third wave. So right now, we have only administered about, I think I can tell you how many doses were administered. Instead of guessing, let me just look it up. So the total number of vaccines we have administered as of today is, just one second, this is yesterday's, let's see the cumulative. Yeah, so we have administered 18 crore vaccines, doses.
Correct.
And we're 140 crore people. That barely 1.3, 1.4%. It's not going to get us very far. So you really have to ramp it up to a good chunk. And there's one more debate which is going on, which I'm not competent to answer, but other medical professionals are looking at it. When you have a vaccines in insufficient numbers, is it better to give more doses to fewer people or fewer doses to more people?
Correct.
In other words, should we focus on giving at least one dose to everybody, or giving 2 doses to some people, or some hybrid strategy? For example, you can say everybody over 60 gets 2 shots, and if you're under 60, because that's the group at the highest risk, you say.
Correct.
And everybody who's under 60 but over 18 gets 1 shot, and then you get the second shot. These are all strategies that someone has to work out in a careful way.
Correct.
It cannot be done in a haphazard manner.
Correct.
And the only way to avoid confusion is for somebody in the government to listen to the experts, come out with a strategy, and then announce it and stick to it.
Correct.
Don't just go on changing strategies, saying, for example, in April you said 45 and above, then suddenly you announce that on May 1st, 18 and above, but there are no vaccines.
Correct.
That just causes massive confusion. So those are some of the ways in which I think the vaccine hesitancy can be combated and vaccine administration can be improved. So,
correct. So essentially, putting some method to madness is what we need at this point to safeguard ourselves from the third wave or the third bump, as you said. So with this, I'm going to ask my last question, and that is going to be about the third wave, because the second wave hit us really hard. And it hit us home. I mean, there's a lot of us who've seen some kind of, somebody from the known either getting infected or losing the battle to the COVID-19 virus. And like you very correctly pointed, that while the first wave, there was this class difference, correct? So while the first wave impacted the non-affluent classes more, the second wave impacted the affluent people more. So what can we expect with the third wave? Have we already made certain predictions? Are the parameters in place to predict whether at all is there going to be a third wave? If, then when? And how severe is it going to be? Is it going to be as bad as the second wave, or can we expect some respite in it?
So I will divide my answer into 2 parts. The first part of my answer is going to be that the third wave will unfortunately hit younger people. It can even hit children.
Oh.
We almost never heard of children catching COVID in the first wave.
Correct.
We're hearing a little bit in the second wave, and we'll hear a lot more during the third wave. And the reason for that is, you think about the virus like a big bully. It goes after the most defenseless people.
Correct.
So if it finds that most of the adults are now able to fight it off, it sort of lowers its target, so to speak. So that is going to be the bad thing. So we have to figure out how we are going to protect children
Correct.
and also some of the younger people.
Hmm.
Second thing is, the second part of my answer is that the onset of a third wave, by which I mean cases going down and then beginning to turn up again, that is inevitable. That you can't stop. And that will happen anywhere between 6 to 8 months from now. But what you can figure out is, can it just go up gently or does it go up like this? Like what happened this time? That is really the battle that we're fighting. That's why I made this joke about third bump versus third wave. If you think that it's not going to be even a slight bump, then I think you're being a little bit unrealistic. There will be some increase in cases. But the idea is to moderate that increase in cases. And there's another interesting question, which I'm not competent to answer because my degrees are in engineering, but these are more like behavioral psychology. Once the second wave begins to die down, which it will in about 2 months' time, is it better to keep enforcing all this masking and distancing, all this kind of a thing? Or you relax them for a couple of months and put them back in place once the cases begin to rise, once the cases begin to rise again. Because I think one of the things that happened this time is that the kind of a lockdown fatigue has set into people.
Correct.
They said to themselves, how long are we going to do this? How many months? And then on top of that, you see all kinds of people on TV not bothering to wear masks, whether it is farmers' protests, whether it is Kumbh Mela, whether it is political rallies, whether it is all the weddings and birthday parties and vacations people were doing. And so I think people just were sort of in a lockdown fatigue mode. So how do we actually prevent that from happening? As I say, I don't know the answer because I'm not a behavioral psychologist, but we must make sure that in this next round, people don't in fact let their guard down.
Correct.
Now, it is not yet clear whether we need to maintain the lockdown protocol even during the lull between the two, that is the second wave end and the third wave onset, or we can relax a little bit and then reinforce them. So what we can do using the Sutra model is we can simulate various scenarios. And then so we can't actually make policy recommendations because we are not in that sphere. But we can tell the policymakers, if you do this, this is what is likely to happen. If you do that, this is likely to happen. Now you choose based on other considerations.
Correct.
For example, everybody wants to maintain economic activity. Obviously, there is a trade-off between economic activity and the virus. You can lock everything down, reduce the virus, but you're also killing jobs and putting people at risk.
True.
So those kinds of decisions we cannot make. What we can do, however, is to put alternate scenarios in front of the policymakers and let them decide.
So has work begun?
Does that answer your question? I hope I answered what you asked and not something else.
That's completely all right. But I just wanted to understand, have we already begun the process to kind of compile these different scenarios, or is that going to happen only once we're out of the second wave?
So one thing we are doing now, and you can say we have almost done it. In the second wave, because of this decentralization, every state had its own lockdown policies.
Correct.
We have a number of different lockdown models, you can say.
Correct.
And we are able to assess the impact of these different lockdown models on the parameter that we called beta, the contact rate.
Correct.
So we're already able to tell anybody who's interested which lockdown models work best. So we're trying to write another paper.
Understand that.
Pardon me?
If you could help us understand that, if you've already come to some kind of a result or an answer to it, of which kind of model, lockdown model actually worked for us.
So we don't want to scoop our paper because we haven't written it yet, but let me just say in broad terms that is very heavy-handed, shut everything down except for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours a day is not the best model.
Interesting.
Because what it does, it forces everybody to squeeze into this very small period.
Correct.
And actually it increases contact, not decreases it.
True.
The best model is where you let normal activities go on, let shops and all that be open, just prevent congregation. Make sure that weddings are small. Definitely no mega events like political jamborees, politicians' birthday parties, and all that kind of thing. That kind of a model seems to work best in terms of reducing the contract rate. That's the criterion we are using. So, but we'll publish in a few weeks' time a state-by-state analysis of what was the beta parameter before the lockdown, what was the beta parameter after the lockdown, and what was the percentage reduction.
Interesting.
So that will make it very, very clear which lockdown policy works better than which other policy. So in other words, what I'm saying is we're quantifying the impact of a lockdown rather than just people just guessing.
That will be amazing. That will actually be fantastic. Before we end the session,
we hope the reviewers of the journal think it is fantastic, but we think it's a nice idea to actually make it quantitative.
Most definitely. Because actually my next question was going to be about whether the center should actually take the control back and whether should we have a centralized protocol for the entire nation. But like you very interestingly said that, this decentralization process actually gave us an opportunity to study the various protocols of how well each one of them is working. And probably, I'm not competent to answer a guess or make a guesswork, but probably when these results are out and when the research paper is out, we could probably centralize the entire process again. I'm not very sure if that's going to happen or whether it should happen, but what are your thoughts on it? Whether it will be a good idea for center to take it back in its control?
So here's my answer to that question. So once we publish these results and we make a recommendation to say such and such a lockdown strategy works the best, based on our analysis of the different lockdown scenarios, I think what is most important is that the best lockdown strategy is followed.
Correct.
It really doesn't matter whether the center imposes that one lockdown strategy on the whole country, or each state government says, oh, okay, these guys are saying this lockdown strategy works best, and they have scientific evidence for that, let's go with it.
Correct.
Functionally, there is no great difference between the two.
All right.
Our belief is that some of the states which are following suboptimal lockdown policies are doing so because they don't have any quantitative evaluation of how effective their lockdown strategies are.
Correct.
So once our paper comes out, even if it is a decentralized implementation of lockdowns, we hope that each state will, in its own way, decide, okay, we'll go with this policy because these fellows have proven that this is the best policy.
Correct.
Do you understand what I'm saying? That we're giving the right advice, and whether the advice is taken by each state individually or whether it is taken by the center and then imposed on each state, it really should not matter. And I don't have a firm opinion one way or the other. Correct. What I do have a firm opinion on is that every state should follow the best lockdown strategy.
Correct.
And however that happens, it doesn't really matter to us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you so much, Professor, for joining us today for a very, very informative session. Definitely a lot to learn from, to understand how this works, because a pandemic is new to every one of us, and all that we're left to do is a lot of guesswork, which also results, unfortunately, in a lot of misinformation. So thank you so much, Professor, for joining us today, for helping us clear our doubts and for helping us understand the current crisis better. Thank you so much, audience, for joining us today in this discussion. This is me, Akshata Bhadoria from Op India, signing off. Thank you.
Thanks.